The Delaware River moved with a slow, dark patience, its winter current carrying flecks of broken ice past the small New Jersey town below. High above it, on a hill cut by decades of wind and snow, stood the Mercy Hill Nunnery. The building seemed older than the soil it rested on, its stones stained by the weight of uncounted winters, its spire lost in the pale fog that often rolled in from the water. From the narrow streets of the town, people would glance upward at it without meaning to, as though their eyes were pulled to it by some quiet force. It was not a place that drew the curious. No one wandered up the steep, frost-bitten road unless they had reason, and those reasons were usually whispered in private. The nuns were seen in town only when necessary, moving in pairs, always on foot, their habits swaying with a measured grace. They spoke softly, smiled faintly, and paid in coins so polished they looked untouched by time. There was a sense among the townsfolk that to look too long at them was impolite, and to ask questions was dangerous. They were the keepers of the hill, and the hill kept its own. The sound of the bells was the one constant, carrying across the valley whether the air was still or screaming with wind. They rang for mass, for funerals, for vespers. But sometimes, late at night, they would ring at odd hours, slow and deliberate, their echoes rolling over the frozen fields like a voice no one wanted to understand. Some claimed it was the old bell mechanism slipping in the cold. Others said nothing at all. In Mercy Hill, silence was as much a language as prayer. The fog that hung over the river would often curl itself around the nunnery in the mornings, wrapping its towers and walls until it looked less like a building than a shadow caught in the mist. From the riverbank it appeared as though time itself moved differently up there, as though the seasons hesitated to pass. Inside the town's single tavern, stories about the hill sometimes found their way into the mouths of the restless or the drunk. There were tales of orphans taken in and never seen again, of candles burning in windows that had been bricked over years before, of low chanting carried on the wind during storms. None of these were spoken in daylight, and never within reach of Father Rourke, the parish priest who had a way of reminding people without raising his voice that God saw all and forgave little. Yet there were older men and women who could recall funerals with no caskets, processions led by veiled sisters who sang in voices that seemed to hum from the ground rather than the throat. Some swore that when the bells rang 13 times, a count no church should ever make, something in the air would change, and the animals in the fields would grow restless. In this particular winter, the nunnery was quieter than usual. Even the bells seemed reluctant to break the cold air. The hill's road was crusted with ice, its trees stripped bare, their black branches scratching at the pale sky. From the town's edge, the building's shape looked almost skeletal, its long windows glinting faintly like watchful eyes. Few in town would admit it aloud, but there was a sense that the hill was holding its breath. Those who passed by the foot of the road sometimes thought they heard faint, layered voices drifting down, not quite singing, not quite speaking, and the sound would fade before they could be certain it was real. Children were told not to linger there, though no one explained why. It was one of those unspoken rules that felt older than the town itself. The nuns, when they did appear, were polite but distant, their words brief, their smiles fleeting. They would ask after ailing relatives, offer blessings, and then vanish back up the hill before the conversation could drift beyond the safe and expected. There was something in their eyes not unkind but unreadable, as though they were trained to show warmth without revealing the shape of what lay beneath. In the years to come, those who had met them would struggle to describe this expression, settling on words like measured or still, though neither quite captured the truth. As the river crept under its thin veil of ice and the frost deepened on the fields, the town carried on in its rhythm, pretending the hill was just another part of the landscape. But every so often a passing thought would catch in the minds of those who looked up at the nunnery's dark silhouette, that perhaps the place was not watching over them at all, but watching them, taking note, waiting. And somewhere deep within its walls, beyond the reach of the fog and the winter sun, something stirred that had been still for far too long. The road to Mercy Hill was steeper than it appeared from below, its stones slick with ice and lined with crooked wooden crosses half buried in snow. Sister Magdalene Rowe climbed it alone, the hem of her plain gray postulant's gown dragging in the frost. She had been walking since dawn from the coach station, her fingers stiff inside thin wool gloves, the cold gnawing through her bones. The letter summoning her here had arrived 3 weeks earlier, written in a precise, delicate hand on paper that smelled faintly of incense. It had spoken of a calling too urgent to delay, a need for young women of obedience, devotion, and fortitude to join the Sisters of Mercy Hill in their work. Magdalene, who had known little but orphanages and church wards, took the invitation as a sign from God. The gates were taller than she expected, black iron speared into points, their hinges fixed into thick stone pillars carved with Latin she could not fully read. Beyond them, the courtyard was bare save for a frozen fountain, its angel statue worn smooth as if the face had been erased. The front doors opened before she could knock, and the Mother Superior stepped into view. She was a tall, thin woman with skin as pale as the winter light and eyes the color of cold slate. Her smile was soft yet unyielding, like a gesture performed countless times until it no longer carried warmth but only shape. She welcomed Magdalene by name without asking for it, her voice low and melodic, carrying the authority of someone used to being heard in silence. Inside, the nunnery smelled faintly of wax and something older, a faint mineral scent like wet stone kept in darkness for years. The hallways were narrow and high-ceilinged, their walls lined with paintings of saints whose eyes seemed to follow her as she walked. The candles burned low in wrought iron holders, their flames hardly moving in the still air. Magdalene noticed how the sound of her own footsteps seemed to vanish quickly, swallowed by the walls as if the building itself disliked noise. She was taken first to the chapel, where rows of polished wooden pews faced a tall altar draped in heavy cloth. Above it, where she expected to see a crucifix, there hung instead an ornate wooden lattice, its pattern unfamiliar, almost like interlocking ribs. The Mother Superior spoke of the daily schedule: prayers before dawn, labor in the kitchens or laundry, study of scripture in the afternoons, vespers at dusk, and night prayers for those selected. Magdalene was told she would have a small room in the east wing and that she must keep her door locked at night, for the sake of order. The other sisters moved through the halls with precise, measured steps, their heads bowed, their hands often hidden inside their sleeves. They nodded at Magdalene but said little, as though conversation without necessity was discouraged. One nun, older and stooped, passed her in the corridor carrying a large brass key ring, each key different in shape and size. The sound of them clinking together seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. Magdalene thought she saw a small iron cross etched into the largest key, though it was gone from sight before she could be sure. Her room was sparse but clean, with a narrow bed, a wooden desk, and a single candle holder fixed to the wall. The window was set deep into the stone, the glass slightly warped so that the view of the town below shimmered as if underwater. She set her small travel bag down and sat on the bed listening. Somewhere faintly she heard the bells. Not the steady call of the tower above, but a quieter chiming, almost hidden in the walls. She could not tell if it was real or imagined. That evening she was led to the refectory where the sisters ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against bowls and the occasional creak of the long wooden benches. Before the meal, a prayer was spoken not in Latin or English, but in a language Magdalene did not recognize, the syllables soft and winding. The Mother Superior's eyes scanned the room as she spoke, and though her tone was gentle, Magdalene felt as though she were being weighed, measured, and set aside for some unseen purpose. Later, alone in her room, Magdalene found she could not sleep. The wind clawed at the shutters, and somewhere below she thought she heard a low, rhythmic hum, like voices carried through stone. She rose, pressing her ear to the floor, and the sound grew clearer. Not words, but tones, layered and deliberate, like a hymn without melody. She stayed like that until her knees ached from the cold. When at last the noise faded, she returned to bed and lay staring into the dark, a thin unease curling through her chest. She told herself it was only the wind, that she had not yet learned the old building's sounds. But in the stillness before sleep, she could not shake the sense that she had stepped into a place where the rules of the outside world did not entirely apply, and where some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. The first week at Mercy Hill moved with a strange, quiet rhythm, each day folding into the next without clear edges. Magdalene's tasks were simple: sweeping stone corridors, carrying linens to the laundry, scrubbing the pews in the chapel until the wood gleamed under the candlelight. Yet beneath the still order of her new life she felt a pressure, like a faint vibration under her skin, as though the building itself was not at rest. The air in certain corridors seemed heavier, harder to breathe. In the afternoon she often caught sight of a nun disappearing behind a locked door at the far end of the west wing, carrying bundles wrapped in dark cloth. The sisters spoke little, their words clipped and functional, and the sound of laughter, common even in the strictest orphanages she had known, was entirely absent. One night, after a late shift in the kitchens, Magdalene was told to bring a small jug of oil to the chapel for the altar lamps. The corridors were dim, lit only by a few candles that painted shifting shadows across the walls. As she entered the chapel, she noticed something she had never seen before. The floor at the base of the altar was bare of rugs, its stone surface polished smooth by decades of footfall. But in the flickering light, she saw faint lines carved into the stone, curves and angles forming a pattern she could not place. She knelt to look closer, tracing the lines with her fingers, and felt the chill of the stone interrupted by a faint warmth beneath her palm. Her eyes followed the pattern toward the back of the altar, where a section of the floor seemed different. Darker, slightly raised, as though concealing something beneath. She moved around the altar, careful not to spill the oil, and there, tucked behind the heavy drape of the altar cloth, she found it. A square of iron set flush with the floor, its edges bound in thick hinges. The metal etched with symbols so worn they looked almost like cracks. When she laid her hand on it, the iron was warm, unnervingly so, as though heated from below. Before she could study it further, she heard footsteps. She rose quickly, stepping away from the altar as Sister Agnes, a tall, severe woman with a narrow face, entered carrying a bundle of unlit candles. Her gaze flicked from Magdalene to the base of the altar, lingering just long enough for Magdalene to feel the weight of her suspicion. Without a word, Sister Agnes crossed the room, set the candles down, and knelt at the altar, draping the cloth more fully to hide the iron square. The movement was practiced, efficient, like someone covering an open wound. Magdalene excused herself quickly, but the image of the trapdoor stayed with her long after she returned to her room. That night, sleep came in short, shallow bursts. She dreamt of standing in the chapel while the iron square lifted slowly, revealing only darkness below, from which a chorus of voices rose. Not cries, not hymns, but something between the two, their tones weaving into each other in a way that made her chest tighten. When she awoke, her hands were clutching the blanket so tightly her fingers ached. The next morning she asked Sister Mercy, the kitchen nun, about the space beneath the chapel. The older woman froze for a moment before turning back to her work, her knife moving through bread with mechanical precision. She did not look up when she muttered, "There is nothing beneath the chapel but stone." Magdalene pressed, asking about the symbols carved into the floor. Sister Mercy's knife stilled, her shoulders stiffening, and then she crossed herself 3 times in quick succession. "Some doors," she said in a voice low enough to be swallowed by the sound of the knife against the board, "are not meant for you." The words carried no anger, no warning, only the hollow certainty of someone who had long accepted that some truths were better left buried. But for Magdalene, they had the opposite effect. The knowledge that something was hidden there, so carefully guarded, set a slow fire of curiosity in her chest. Whatever lay beneath the chapel was not only part of the nunnery's life, it was its center, its pulse. And she could feel it beating, faintly but steadily, every time she walked the cold stone halls. The winter deepened, bringing with it nights so cold the river's surface froze in long, jagged plates. The days passed in an unchanging rhythm. But Magdalene had begun to notice small shifts, a nun missing from evening prayers without explanation, a door left ajar in a hallway that was usually locked, a faint smell of smoke in the chapel long after the candles were extinguished. She learned that the nunnery kept a handful of orphans, children from the town and surrounding villages taken in for care and religious instruction. They were rarely seen outside their lessons, but their voices sometimes floated through the corridors, singing hymns with a purity that seemed almost unnatural in its perfect pitch and steadiness. Among them was Thomas, a boy of about 10 with a clear, bright voice that carried even in the smallest whisper of a hymn. Magdalene met him only once in the laundry where he had been sent to fetch linens. He greeted her with a polite bow of his head, his eyes strangely calm for a child. There was a fragility to him, not of body but of spirit, as though every movement was measured to avoid drawing too much attention. She learned from Sister Mercy that he was favored for his voice, often chosen to lead the orphans in song during special prayers. It was said in tones meant to sound like pride but tinged with something else, that when he sang, the air itself seemed to still. One evening, the Mother Superior announced during supper that Thomas had been called for a special blessing after night prayers. The other children at the table did not look up, did not whisper, did not exchange glances. Their silence was not the silence of obedience, but of something learned long ago. The stillness of creatures who know not to stir when danger is near. Magdalene felt an unease coil inside her, but she said nothing. That night, as she prepared for bed, she heard the chapel bells. It was not the usual steady peal for prayers. This was slower, each toll drawn out as though marking not time but distance. She counted them without meaning to. 10, 11, 12, 13. The 13th toll hung in the air, and for a moment she thought she heard another sound layered beneath it. A faint, wavering note, high and thin like the echo of a boy's voice carried through the floor. The next morning, Thomas was gone. No announcement was made beyond a brief statement from the Mother Superior that he had moved on to serve the Lord in a higher way. The children went about their chores with the same unnatural calm. The nuns moved through the halls without change, and the bells did not ring again that day. But Magdalene noticed something different in the air, a heaviness that seemed to cling to the walls themselves. In the days that followed, Magdalene made quiet inquiries. She asked Sister Mercy if Thomas had been sent to another convent or to live with a family in town. But the woman only shook her head once sharply before turning away. Sister Agnes, when approached, fixed Magdalene with a gaze so unblinking it felt like a warning in itself. Even the children avoided her questions, lowering their eyes and walking away without a word. It was as though Thomas had been swallowed whole by the hill, leaving no trace but the echo of his voice. One evening, while carrying linens past the chapel, Magdalene paused outside the heavy wooden doors. She thought she heard singing, faint but distinct. It was not the layered, steady hum she had heard before. It was a single voice, pure and trembling, weaving through a melody she did not recognize. She pressed her ear to the door, her breath clouding in the cold air. The sound was coming from below, from beneath the stone floor. It rose and fell in slow, aching notes, then broke abruptly, replaced by a low murmur of many voices, their tones blending in a way that made her stomach turn. She stepped back quickly, her pulse racing, and nearly collided with Sister Agnes, who had appeared without sound in the hallway. The older nun's face was unreadable, but her eyes, dark and steady, lingered on Magdalene's as though weighing whether to speak. Finally, in a voice so low it was almost part of the air itself, she said, "The bells tell you when the Lord is listening. Best you never count them." Then she turned and walked away, her steps silent on the stone. That night Magdalene lay awake, the sound of the 13 tolls replaying in her mind. She began to wonder if the iron square beneath the altar was not simply a door, but a threshold, and that once someone passed beneath it, they did not return in the same way, if at all. Somewhere in the nunnery, the voices would begin again soon, and she knew now that Thomas's would be among them. 3 nights after Thomas vanished, Magdalene was summoned by the Mother Superior herself. The call came after evening prayers when the sisters were dispersing to their cells. A novice approached her in the corridor, eyes lowered, and said simply, "You have been chosen for night prayers." Magdalene had heard the phrase whispered before but never explained. She followed the novice through the silent halls, their footsteps sounding softer than usual, as though the air itself was absorbing the noise. The chapel was lit only by a handful of candles, their flames bending under a faint draft that seemed to come from nowhere. The Mother Superior stood at the altar, her hands folded, her gaze fixed not on Magdalene but on the iron square in the floor. Sister Agnes and 2 other nuns approached from the shadows, each carrying a tall lamp filled with dark oil. Without a word, the altar cloth was lifted and the hinges of the trapdoor gave a muted groan as it swung open. The warm air that rose from below was not the air of fire or hearth. It smelled faintly of breath and stone, of spaces where people had been for far too long. A narrow staircase spiraled down into the dark. Magdalene followed the Mother Superior, the other sisters behind her, their lamps casting trembling light against the walls. The stone steps were worn smooth and dipped in the center, as though thousands of feet had passed this way. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became until it felt like wading through invisible water. At the base of the stairs, the passage opened into a wide chamber. The walls were lined with tall, thin alcoves, each containing a figure kneeling in silence. Magdalene thought at first they were statues, until one shifted, and she saw the slow, shallow rise and fall of breath. Children and young adolescents, their faces pale and still, eyes half closed as though caught between waking and sleep. They wore simple white garments, their skin marked with faint lines, not scars, but something stranger, as though their veins had been traced with ink beneath the flesh. In the center of the room stood a frame of dark wood, taller than a man and shaped like a great crown. Only when she looked closer did Magdalene see that it was made not entirely of wood. Interlaced among the beams were curved human jawbones, their teeth still intact, polished to a dull ivory sheen. The air seemed to hum around it, a vibration that prickled her skin. The Mother Superior raised her hands and the nuns began to hum, low and steady. The sound was not music in the ordinary sense, but a vibration that seemed to move through the stone floor into Magdalene's feet, into her chest. The children stirred, their heads lifting slightly. Then, as if pulled by unseen strings, their mouths opened in unison and the chamber filled with sound. It was not like any choir Magdalene had ever heard. The voices were hollow, breathless, stripped of the small imperfections that give life to song. Each note was exact, unwavering, as though the singers were no longer capable of error. The harmony was perfect, too perfect, and it sent a cold ache into the marrow of her bones. She searched the line of faces and saw Thomas among them, his eyes half-lidded, lips moving in precise rhythm. His gaze did not change when it passed over her. It was as if he no longer recognized her at all. The sound built until it was almost physical, pressing against her skull, making her teeth ache. Magdalene realized then that the jawbone crown was not decoration. It was resonating, amplifying the voices in a way that made the air tremble. For a moment she thought she could hear words hidden in the harmony, but they slipped away as soon as she tried to grasp them. When the chant ended, the children's mouths closed in unison, and their heads bowed again, their breathing returning to that slow, shallow rhythm. The Mother Superior lowered her hands, and the hum of the nuns faded into silence. Without acknowledging Magdalene, she turned and led the way back up the stairs. Magdalene followed, her thoughts clawing for reason, but finding only the echo of that sound still vibrating in her chest. Back in her cell, she sat in the dark for a long time, her hands trembling. She now knew where Thomas had gone, and that he had not left the hill at all. Whatever this ritual was, it was not meant to be seen by outsiders. Yet they had brought her there, allowed her to witness it. And that, she realized, could only mean one thing. They intended for her to be part of it. In the days after the night prayers, Magdalene carried the memory of the choir like a hidden wound. The sound had not left her. It lingered in her bones, surfacing in moments of stillness, as if her own heartbeat had learned to echo its rhythm. She avoided the Mother Superior's gaze during meals, kept her questions buried, and tried to perform her duties without drawing attention. But her mind kept circling back to the children in the alcoves, to the strange markings beneath their skin, to Thomas's empty stare. Her chance for answers came unexpectedly. She was summoned to assist in the nunnery's library, a place she had never been permitted before. The room was small and dim, lined with high shelves of leather-bound volumes whose spines were cracked with age. Sister Agnes was there, seated at a heavy desk, a stack of parchment before her. She gestured for Magdalene to sit and copy passages from one of the open books. The script was dense and uneven, written in a mix of Latin and another language she did not recognize. But as she worked, she began to piece together fragments of meaning. The text spoke of preserving the vessel and binding the breath of innocence to the holy relic. It described a process in which the body was kept from decay, its age suspended by the joining of voice and bone. The voice, it said, was the soul's purest tether. If kept singing in perfect devotion, it would never release the body entirely. There were passages that spoke of vigilance through the generations and children unspent by time who wait for the end of all seasons. Magdalene's pen trembled as she copied the words, but she forced herself to keep writing, her eyes scanning the margins for more. The margins themselves were filled with notations in a finer hand. Corrections, additions, small warnings. One line in particular caught her breath. The mind will fade before the flesh. This is mercy, for memory makes rebellion. She thought of Thomas's expressionless face, of the way the children's eyes had seemed half-closed even in song. This was not preservation for healing or safety. It was a way of holding them in a kind of living death, their voices harvested for something sacred and terrible. When Sister Agnes stepped away to fetch more ink, Magdalene's gaze fell on a large rolled parchment resting on a nearby shelf. She unbound it quickly, her fingers moving with a desperation she could not hide from herself. It was a diagram of the underchapel, drawn with precision. The alcoves were marked with numbers, each corresponding to a name listed in the margins. At the top of the page was a title written in deep brown ink, The 42. She counted the names, 42 in all, each paired with a small notation of the year they had been bound. Some years stretched back decades. Next to Thomas's name was the number 1833, the current year. A shadow fell across the parchment. Magdalene froze, rolling it back just as Sister Agnes returned. The nun said nothing, but her eyes lingered on Magdalene's face for a moment too long. Magdalene felt heat rise in her chest, not from guilt, but from a sharp and growing anger. This was no holy duty. This was a prison of the soul. That night she could not sleep. The bells rang softly in the distance, their sound threading through the dark like a question that had no safe answer. She thought of the doctrine of preservation as it had been written, the careful justifications, the insistence that this was mercy. She imagined the first child who had been bound, the fear that must have filled their last waking thoughts before the ritual stole their mind. How many parents had been told this was salvation? How many had handed over their sons and daughters believing they were protecting them from death, never knowing they were delivering them into a fate far colder? Her thoughts returned to the jawbone crown, to the way it had seemed to drink in the sound to amplify it. If the voices were the tether, then the crown was the anchor. And without it, perhaps the tether would break. She did not know how such a thing could be destroyed, nor whether the children's bodies would survive the release. But she knew one thing with certainty. If she did nothing, she too might one day be standing in an alcove, her voice hollow, her mind gone, her life measured not in years, but in hymns. The cold in her small room felt sharper that night, as though the hill itself was aware of her thoughts. Somewhere below, in the silence under the chapel, the preserved children waited, their slow breath keeping time with the doctrine's cruel rhythm. Magdalene's hands curled into fists beneath the blanket. The Sisters of Mercy Hill called it preservation, but she knew the truth now. It was possession, and she was already caught in its shadow. The red room lay behind a door that did not match the others, its wood stained a deep brown that looked almost wet, its handle cold even through a glove. Magdalene reached it by following Sister Agnes through the west wing at dusk, past windows bricked over from the inside, past a corridor whose lamps were always turned low. Inside, the room was narrow and long, with walls the color of old blood and shelves lined with copper basins. Each basin held rosaries turned black from use, their beads dull, their crosses pitted. On the far table lay a ledger so heavy it sagged the wood beneath it, and beside it sat a plate of quills trimmed to sharp points. Parents were brought here by appointment, not to see their children, but to be seen by the rule. They came poor and afraid, led by a gentle sister with clean hands and a steady voice. And they were seated across from the Mother Superior, as if entering a court they did not know existed. The petition was read with care, promising shelter, health, daily bread, and a path to heaven already begun. Then the mother would lift a small vial and add a single drop to the inkwell. Magdalene learned it was called vow ink, made from iron gall and ash scraped from old altar cloths, mixed with a trace of oil from the lamp that burned over the underchapel. The parents signed slowly, their names shaking, while a bell hidden in the wall chimed once for each letter written, as if counting the cost. When the last stroke was set, the quill was placed into a basin and left to blacken among the rosaries. The page did not dry like normal ink. It fixed at once, as if it had been waiting for their names. Sister Agnes recorded the child's birth year and a note in the margin: voice, pulse, or silence. Magdalene learned the meaning. Voice meant the child would be trained for song. Pulse meant the child's blood held a strong rhythm and would not tire under the binding. Silence meant a child who did not cry, who watched too closely, who would endure the long stillness under stone. None of these sounded like mercy when she read them, only assignments in a plan that left no room for love. There was a ritual for the transfer. The parents knelt at a low rail while a cloth was placed across their hands, and a candle was pressed between their palms until a small ring of wax cooled around their skin. They were told this sealed the pact. The wax carried a faint scent of frankincense and something bitter. Magdalene later saw the cooled ring stacked in a small glass cabinet, thin and pale as fallen moons. In a locked drawer, she found small metal forks set to different notes, each stamped with a number. Sister Agnes called them testers. A child would hum against a fork and the metal would sing back, telling the sisters whether the tone would hold for hours without breaking. Those who wavered were kept upstairs. Those who matched were listed for night prayers. It was not only the voice that was measured. In a hidden alcove, a nurse with quiet eyes placed a child's hand on a drum of stretched skin and counted the beats as a weight turned. If the beats stayed even, the child was marked pulse. If not, there was a second test that made Magdalene's stomach turn. The nurse would place a cold coin on the child's tongue and count to 10. If the tongue trembled but the child did not cry, the word silence was written by the name. The sisters said it was to protect the children from fear. Magdalene saw it for what it was, a search for the ones who would not fight the dark. What broke her most was the farewell. The parents were allowed a single touch, fingertips to forehead, and then they were guided out through a different door so they would never learn the path back. After they left, Sister Agnes would lift the signed page toward the red wall and press it flat. The paint took the ink smell into itself, and the letters seemed to grow darker by the hour, as if the room fed on their promise. Once late at night, Magdalene found a row of small glass tubes hidden behind the ledger. Each held a curled thread like a tiny smoke trail. She realized they were hair, one twist from each child clipped during their first prayer. The label read anchors. There was one tube with a name she knew, Clara, with the year scratched beside it twice, as if someone had tried to erase the first mark and could not. Magdalene closed the drawer with shaking hands. She understood now how the hill kept its hold. Not by force at the gate, but by a system that made despair look like devotion. The red room was a machine, and the children were its fuel. As the lamps were dimmed and the lock turned, a low sound rose from the floor. The same deep hum she had heard below, as if the room itself was tuned to the underchapel. Magdalene stepped back into the corridor, carrying the taste of iron in her mouth, and knew that if anyone could resist it, it would be the girl whose name had been written twice. The path forward was not yet clear, but the next step would be toward Clara, the one who would not fade. Clara was unlike the others. Magdalene first saw her during laundry duty, standing apart from the row of preserved children who were brought up in shifts to have their garments washed. The others moved in that same slow, unbroken rhythm, eyes downcast, their hands limp at their sides. Clara, however, watched the room with a sharp, restless gaze, her head tilting slightly whenever someone passed too close. Her skin was pale, but there was a faint flush to her cheeks, and her lips carried a trace of color as though life still moved in her with more force than it should after so many years. Magdalene didn't know how she was certain, but she could feel that this girl did not belong fully to the hollow choir below. Their first true meeting came by chance, or perhaps by Clara's quiet design. Magdalene had been sent to carry folded linens to the storage rooms in the east wing. As she passed the narrow stairwell near the laundry, she heard a whisper, so low it might have been the settling of the stone. But then it came again, her name, shaped with careful breath. She turned to find Clara standing in the shadow of the stairs, her eyes locked on Magdalene's. For a moment neither moved, as if both were testing the reality of the other. Then Clara stepped forward close enough that Magdalene could see faint, pale marks circling her wrists. Scars, but unlike any she had seen before. They were too even, too deliberate, as though burned there by a careful hand. "You're new," Clara said in a voice that was hoarse, dry, as if unused for months. Magdalene nodded, unable to speak. Clara glanced over her shoulder toward the corridor, then leaned closer. "You've seen it," she said, her tone flat, not a question. Magdalene felt a shiver rise along her spine. Clara's eyes, dark and intent, searched hers for any sign of denial. When none came, she continued. "They took me in 22 years ago. I was 11. I am still 11. Magdalene's breath caught, though she had suspected as much from the doctrine's pages. Clara held up her hands, showing the burn rings at her wrists. "I tried once," she said. "Fire breaks the binding, but it must be joined with confession. Without both, it only scars." She pulled her sleeves back down, her gaze never leaving Magdalene's face. "They think I've given up. I haven't. But I can't do it alone." Magdalene wanted to ask 100 questions. Why her mind remained when the others had faded, why she had not been silenced. But the sound of approaching footsteps cut the moment short. Clara stepped back into the stairwell's shadow, her expression smoothing into the still mask worn by the preserved. Sister Agnes rounded the corner and glanced briefly at Magdalene, saying nothing before continuing down the hall. When the air was clear again, Clara whispered, "If you mean to leave this place, you must understand. The crown is the key, but the crown is fed. Break the feeding, break the hold." Then she slipped away, her movement swift and silent, leaving Magdalene rooted to the stone. That night Magdalene lay awake, her mind replaying every word. The crown, the interwoven jawbones that had seemed to drink the children's voices, was not only a symbol. It was an instrument of control, something that bound their bodies to the ritual. "Fed," Clara had said. Magdalene thought of the red room, the way each petition name was linked into the ledger and pressed into the red wall, the copper basins filled with blackened rosaries. All of it was part of a system, a circuit of devotion and control. And if Clara was right, disrupting it might unravel everything. Over the next week, Magdalene sought her out in quiet moments. Clara spoke sparingly, her words measured, but each one carried the weight of knowledge gained at great cost. She explained that the preserved could feel the ritual like a pull in their chests, a constant thread of sound even when the chamber was silent. Most surrendered to it, their minds eroded by the endless hum. But Clara had resisted, holding herself at the edge of that pull, refusing to let it take her. "They can't bind what doesn't consent," she said once, almost smiling. Not fully. She told Magdalene that on the night of binding, the jawbone crown was bathed in oil drawn from the lamps of the under-chapel, and that oil carried the essence of every preserved voice. It was replenished with each ritual, ensuring the tether never weakened. To break the crown without first tainting the oil would only destroy the instrument. The tether would remain, and the voices would stay trapped. Magdalene felt the enormity of what Clara was asking her to do, and yet, with each whispered exchange, her resolve hardened. Clara's final warning was simple. Once you begin, you will not have time to finish if they see you, and they will hear you before they see you. Her eyes flicked to the ceiling as if listening to the faint vibration of the bells. They always hear. Magdalene returned to her cell that night with the shape of a plan forming in her mind. It was dangerous, perhaps impossible, but so was staying. And now, for the first time since setting foot on the hill, she felt something other than fear curling in her chest. The sharp, cold edge of intent. The first sign came with the wind. It roared over Mercy Hill in sudden gusts, rattling the shutters and shaking the frost from the eaves. Magdalene was carrying firewood to the east wing when she heard the bells. At first she thought it was the ordinary call for evening prayers, but the sound was wrong, too slow, too deliberate. She counted without meaning to. 12, 11, 10. Her steps faltered. The count was moving backwards. Each toll seemed heavier than the last, the deep metal notes sinking into her chest like stones into water. She set down the wood and stepped into the cloister walk, staring toward the tower. The great bell swayed with unnatural precision, its arc perfectly timed between each strike. With every toll, the air in the cloister thickened, carrying a low, grinding undertone. Not from the bell, but from somewhere beneath her feet. It was the sound of stone shifting against stone. From the corner of her eye, Magdalene saw movement in the garden below. Sister Agnes and two others were standing over a patch of ground freshly turned despite the frozen soil. Between the tolls, she could hear the muffled scrape of shovels. The dirt was dark and wet, steaming faintly in the cold air. When the 11th toll rang, one of the nuns stepped back, revealing a rectangular mound now covered in pale cloth. It was small, too small for an adult. Magdalene moved to the far side of the cloister, following the shadows until she reached the covered walkway that overlooked the chapel yard. The bells continued their backward count, 9, 8, 7. And with each number, the shrouded mound seemed to sink deeper into the soil. The nuns worked without speaking, their movements practiced and synchronized, as though this was a duty they had performed many times before. On the 5th toll, a faint hum began to rise from the ground itself. Magdalene recognized it instantly, the same hollow vibration she had felt in the underchapel, the sound of the bound voices stirring. The air grew warmer, heavy with a damp metallic scent that made her throat tighten. She realized with a chill that the backward tolling was not a mistake. It was a signal, not to call the sisters to prayer, but to release something below. When the final toll came, 1. The hum broke into a short, sharp chord that made the frost on the cloister rail tremble. The nuns stepped back from the mound, now completely covered, and crossed themselves in perfect unison. Then they turned and walked toward the chapel without looking behind them. By the time Magdalene forced herself to breathe again, the mound was gone. In its place was a flat patch of dark soil, already hardening under the cold as if nothing had been there at all. That night the nunnery was quieter than she had ever known it. No bells, no footsteps in the halls, not even the faint shift of stone in the walls. But Magdalene could not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the hill pressing down from above and below. The backward tolling had marked something, a burial, a release, or both. She thought of Clara's warning of how the crown was fed. Whatever had been laid in the garden was part of that feeding, another piece in the machinery of preservation. Near midnight, she rose and lit her candle. The air was still, but she thought she could hear a faint, high note far below, too thin for the bell, too steady for the wind. It pulsed in and out, matching her heartbeat, as if something in the dark was measuring her in return. She snuffed the flame and sat in silence until the sound faded. Only then did she lie back down, her mind already moving toward the next step. The bells had counted down to night. The next time, she suspected, they would count her. The chance came on a morning wrapped in fog so thick the tower bells sounded muted, as if swallowed before they could cross the courtyard. Magdalene was sent to deliver a tray of folded garments to the under-chapel, a task usually reserved for the senior sisters. She carried the bundle carefully, following Sister Agnes down the winding stone steps beneath the altar. The air grew warmer with each turn, the scent of lamp oil and something faintly sweet, like flowers pressed too long between the pages of a book until their scent had turned to dust. The chamber was larger than she remembered and now fully lit. Rows of tall, narrow alcoves lined the walls, each holding a figure kneeling in stillness. Magdalene saw their pale faces more clearly this time, children of varying ages from no more than 6 to nearly grown, though their features all bore the same smooth, ageless quality. Their garments were simple and white, each embroidered at the collar with a name in thread so faded it was little more than a shadow on the cloth. The slow, shallow rise and fall of their breathing was synchronized, as though guided by an unseen hand. Sister Agnes moved toward a table at the far end where a ledger lay open beside a small brass lamp. She began checking garments against the names, her quill scratching softly. Magdalene's eyes drifted to the open page where the names were neatly numbered. She counted 1 through 42, each paired with the year they had been bound. The earliest dates were so far past that the original towns where the children had come from might no longer exist. Magdalene's breath caught when her eyes fell on the most recent name, Thomas Ellery, 1833. Just above it, written in a finer hand, was Clara White, 1811. Beside Clara's name in the margin was an unusual mark, 2 parallel lines with a small cross between them. She didn't know its meaning, but it was the only name marked that way. Sister Agnes noticed her looking and closed the ledger with deliberate care. "These are the preserved," she said quietly, her voice steady but without warmth. The 42. Each one chosen, each one blessed. They do not age, they do not sicken, they sing so that the world may continue. Her eyes lingered on Magdalene. And when their song has ended, the Lord calls another to join them. Magdalene forced herself to look at the faces again. Some seemed barely aware of the world around them, their eyes half-lidded, their lips moving faintly in rhythm to an unheard melody. But others, a small boy in the far alcove, a girl with her head tilted slightly toward the sound of their footsteps, seemed to retain a dim awareness, their gaze following movement in the room. She thought of Clara's sharp eyes the way she had resisted. Not all of them were gone entirely. On a low altar in the center of the chamber sat the jawbone crown. It was larger than she remembered, the interlaced bones polished to a dull gleam, their teeth worn smooth. It rested on a stand of dark wood carved with the same strange symbols she had seen etched into the iron trapdoor above. Around the base, in shallow bowls, burned lamps filled with thick, dark oil. The flame from each lamp flickered toward the crown as if drawn by breath. Magdalene felt the pull of it even from a distance, a faint hum in the air that seemed to sync with her own pulse. Sister Agnes placed the garments on a bench and began tending the lamps, pouring fresh oil from a brass ewer. The scent rose sharply, the same bitter frankincense blend from the red room. Magdalene's mind snapped back to Clara's words. The crown is fed. Each lamp held the essence of every preserved voice, renewed with each ritual. Without the oil, the tether would weaken. Without the crown, it would snap entirely. She moved slowly around the chamber, feigning curiosity at the carvings on the walls, but in truth counting the alcoves, matching them to the ledger. 42. No more, no less. And yet the thought struck her with sudden clarity. If a new child was bound, one must be released. The backward tolling, the fresh mound in the garden. The cycle was constant, unbroken for decades. Sister Agnes closed the last lamp and gestured for Magdalene to follow her out. As they ascended the spiral stairs, Magdalene looked back one final time. The crown caught the lamplight, casting faint tooth-shaped shadows across the stone floor. For a moment she thought she saw Thomas shift in his alcove, his lips moving, shaping her name. But the heavy trapdoor closed before she could be sure. Back in her cell, she pressed her hands to her temples. The 42 were not simply victims. They were the keystones of something vast and deliberate, and now she knew their number, their names, and their anchor. The knowledge burned in her like a hidden ember. If she moved carefully, she could strike at the crown, but only once. There would be no second attempt. The night began with rain, a rare, steady downpour that blurred the view from the hilltop and cloaked the nunnery in a curtain of sound. Magdalene had been waiting for such a night, one in which the noise would swallow the smaller sounds of movement, of locks turning, of stone shifting. Clara met her in the east wing stairwell, the faint lamplight catching the pale burn rings at her wrists. No words were exchanged. They didn't need them. The plan had been spoken only once, in whispers short enough to vanish before they could be overheard. Magdalene carried a bundle of folded altar cloths, the perfect cover for moving through the corridors after vespers. Hidden within the folds were 2 small earthen jars taken from the laundry storeroom. Jars of lye and lamp oil stolen in spoonfuls over the last month until enough had been gathered to matter. Clara moved ahead with the sure-footed quiet of someone who had spent half her life slipping through shadows. The chapel was empty when they entered, its candles burned low. Magdalene's hands trembled as she approached the altar, her fingers closing around the edge of the iron trap door. It was warm, even in the cold air. Together they heaved it open, the hinges sighing like a great beast disturbed in sleep. The stairwell gaped beneath them, spiraling down into darkness lit only by the occasional gleam of lamp oil below. They descended quickly. The hum was already in the air, faint but growing, as though the hill had felt their intrusion. In the chamber, the preserved children knelt in their alcoves, eyes half-lidded, breath moving in that slow, synchronized rise and fall. The crown sat on its stand in the center, the jawbones catching the lamplight in dull yellow glints. Around it, the small bowls of oil burned, their flames swaying toward the crown. Clara moved to the lamps first, pulling the folded altar cloths from Magdalene's arms and using them to smother the flames one by one. Magdalene uncorked the jars, pouring the mixture of lye and oil into the bowls. The sharp, acrid scent filled the chamber, making her eyes water. Clara struck flint over one of the bowls, and the liquid caught instantly, a low blue flame licking the sides before leaping higher. The reaction was immediate. The hum in the air fractured, breaking into jagged tones that made Magdalene's teeth ache. The preserved children stirred, their heads lifting, lips parting as if to sing. But the sound that came was not the perfect harmony she remembered. It was chaotic, uneven, some voices breaking, others shouting in ragged bursts. Sister Agnes's voice rang out from the stairwell, sharp and furious, calling Magdalene's name. The sound spurred them both forward. Clara seized the crown by its wooden base, heaving it from the stand. It was heavier than it looked, and it vibrated in her hands as though resisting. Magdalene grabbed one side, and together they swung it hard against the stone floor. The crack of bone rang through the chamber. The jawbones splintered, several snapping free, teeth scattering across the floor like pale seeds. The effect was like a shudder passing through the room. The children gasped in unison, some collapsing forward, others crying out in confusion. The hum collapsed into silence. Magdalene's heart pounded as she watched Thomas's eyes open fully for the first time. Not the half-lidded gaze of the bound, but wide, clear, frightened. Footsteps thundered down the stairs. The Mother Superior emerged, her face stripped of its measured calm. She advanced on them with a speed that seemed impossible for her thin frame, her voice cutting through the air in a language Magdalene had heard only once before, during the under-chapel rituals. The preserved children flinched at the words, some clutching their heads, others trying to rise. Clara shouted for Magdalene to light the remaining oil. Magdalene struck the flint sparks falling into the nearest bowl. Flames roared upward, leaping from lamp to lamp, spreading across the floor where the spilled oil had pooled. The heat grew fierce, the air filling with the scent of burning cloth and the sharper, bitter note of something far older. The Mother Superior's voice rose to a near scream, the words twisting into a pitch that made the air vibrate painfully. Magdalene felt her knees weaken, her vision blur. Clara grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the stairwell. Behind them, the crown lay in two jagged halves, its pieces blackening in the heat. The children were moving now, stumbling from their alcoves, some clutching at one another, others standing frozen in the chaos. Clara turned back once, shouting to them, but the roar of the flames drowned her voice. The smoke thickened quickly, driving them upward, forcing them through the trap door and into the chapel. The bells began to ring as they emerged, but this time not in ritual. They rang wildly, their strikes uneven, the sound spilling out over the hill and into the town below. The sisters were gathering in the corridors, some screaming prayers, others rushing toward the chapel with buckets of water. The heat behind them swelled, a living thing, pressing them forward into the storm-lashed courtyard. Magdalene felt the rain on her face like a shock, the cold air slicing through the heat, clinging to her clothes. Clara was already pulling her toward the garden's outer gate. Behind them, the flames had reached the spire, and the dark shape of Mercy Hill Nunnery was outlined in fire against the night. The rain would slow the burning, but not stop it. They had struck deep enough to break the tether. Whether the children would survive the unbinding, Magdalene could not know. But the song had ended, and the crown was no more. By dawn, the hill was a silhouette of ruin. Smoke drifted in slow columns over the blackened shell of the nunnery, the rain having thinned to a steady mist that clung to everything it touched. Magdalene and Clara stood at the river's edge, their feet sunk into the damp earth, watching as the current carried away fragments of cloth, scorched and curling at the edges. The water was colder than it should have been for the season, moving with a quiet strength beneath its glassy surface. Clara bent and pulled one of the floating scraps from the water. It was no larger than a hand, the linen brittle from fire, yet in its center a single name was intact, the black thread untouched by flame. Elias. She held it for a moment, her thumb brushing the letters as if memorizing the feel before letting it slip back into the current. More scraps drifted by, Miriam, Silas, Anya, Thomas, each one a child bound to the 42 now unmoored. Magdalene realized the river was carrying the names downstream like a final procession, away from the hill, away from the years of silence. They had escaped the chaos in the courtyard under the cover of smoke and rain. No one had followed them. Perhaps too many were consumed by the fire, or perhaps the sisters knew that without the crown their purpose had already been broken. Magdalene did not know how many of the preserved children had made it out. She remembered some stumbling into the storm, others collapsing near the chapel door, their bodies unused to movement. Whether they lived now was a question she was afraid to answer. The town below was stirring, figures gathering on the riverbank to watch the column of smoke rising from the hill. The bells had fallen silent some time before dawn, their melted shapes hanging useless in the tower that still stood, blackened but unbroken. From where she stood, Magdalene could see no movement among the walls, no flicker of life in the windows. The silence was heavy, as though the hill itself had gone still for the first time in decades. Clara stood beside her, the mist beading in her dark hair. "They'll call it an accident," she said quietly, not looking at Magdalene. "They always do. The records will say fire, nothing more." Magdalene believed her. Even if the townsfolk asked questions, the answers would be locked behind the same walls that had hidden the 42 for generations. The river carried more names past them, each one vanishing slowly into the fog downstream. Magdalene thought of the doctrine of preservation, of the ledger, of the way each life had been reduced to a number and a purpose. The scraps were all that remained of that system now set free into the water like unspoken confessions. She wondered if the current would carry them far enough that someone somewhere would see them and understand, or if they would sink quietly to the bottom, their stories lost with the silt. They stayed until the last scrap passed, the water returning to its natural, unbroken flow. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of wet ash down from the hill. Somewhere far above, a section of wall gave way with a dull, final crack. The sound was less like collapse than release. Clara took a step back from the water, her eyes meeting Magdalene's for a long moment. No words passed between them. There was nothing left to say. As they turned toward the road, Magdalene glanced once more at the river. The surface was smooth now, the current steady, carrying away the last visible trace of the children whose lives had been suspended in stone and silence. The hill would still stand in the eyes of the town, but its power was gone, broken in the dark hours of the storm. Whether that was enough to keep such a thing from rising again, she could not know. But she knew the 42 were no longer singing. The decades that followed blurred the memory of that night into something half-whispered, half-forgotten. Mercy Hill stood in black ruin for years, its scorched stones slowly giving way to ivy and moss. The townsfolk avoided the road that wound up to the gates, claiming the ground was still warm underfoot even in winter. No one rebuilt it. The official record in the parish archives was thin: fire at Mercy Hill Nunnery, cause unknown, losses undisclosed. The report named no dead and listed no survivors. Yet the story lingered in the quiet ways history sometimes chooses to survive. A fisherman claimed he had once caught a scrap of cloth tangled in his net, stitched with a name he did not recognize. A child in the village was said to have woken from a fever speaking a hymn no one had taught them, in a voice too pure to be their own. These were dismissed as local fancy, the sort of talk that turns ordinary places into shadows. But the people of the town never quite stopped glancing up at the hill on fog-heavy mornings, listening for bells that never rang again. It was not until 1875 that the state ordered the site sealed. The last of the stone walls were torn down, the land leveled, and a small memorial built at the river's edge. The memorial was simple, a flat slab of granite, unpolished, bearing 42 names in clean, unadorned script. No dates were given. The list began with the earliest bound and ended with the most recent, Thomas Ellery, his name carved with the same precision as the rest. The townspeople placed flowers there in spring, but only when no one else was watching. Magdalene never returned to Mercy Hill. She left New Jersey within weeks of the fire, moving from parish to parish under false names, always keeping to the edges of church life but never stepping fully inside again. Clara stayed in the region for a time, helping a handful of the preserved children adjust to life beyond the hill. Some never recovered, their bodies failing after decades without change. Others lived on, their faces aging suddenly in the space of a few years, as though time had been waiting for them all along. As the years passed, Magdalene carried the memory not as a wound but as a burden, a ledger she kept in her own mind, where every name was written and never faded. She knew the nunnery's practices were not unique. The doctrine of preservation had been copied into other ledgers, carried to other institutions under different names, Mercy Hill had fallen, but the hunger that built it would look for another shape, another set of walls. That truth kept her from believing in the idea of victory. What she and Clara had done was not an ending. It was a breaking open, a wound in the pattern that she could only hope might slow the next attempt. In her final years, Magdalene lived by the water, far from the hill, in a place where the river's sound was steady and clean. She rarely spoke of Mercy Hill, even when asked directly, but sometimes she would walk to the edge and watch the current. If a scrap of cloth ever passed in the water, she never said. Those who knew her said she had the look of someone always listening, as if waiting for a sound that would tell her whether the world had learned anything at all. Today, the site where Mercy Hill once stood is nothing more than a rise in the land, the earth uneven where the foundations were buried. The memorial stone still rests by the river, its letters worn shallow by rain. Children climb it in summer, using it as a seat to watch the water. They do not know the meaning of the names they sit upon. The town has no appetite for teaching that part of its history. Silence is easier, safer, cleaner. And yet silence is where such things begin. Mercy Hill did not thrive because it was powerful, but because no one spoke of it when it mattered most. Evil, Magdalene once thought, is rarely loud. It waits. It dresses itself in devotion, in order, in promises that sound like protection, and by the time you notice its true face, it has already learned your name. The bells of Mercy Hill will never ring again, but the pattern that built them is not gone. It hides in quiet rooms and careful contracts, in the moments when fear outweighs truth. And so the question remains, carried in the current as surely as those scraps of cloth once were. What do you think? Could this happen again?